Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's LaRouche Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. So there is a topic that we are discussing tonight, what we can learn from the Irish. But in order to set our topic in a certain context, I'm going to refer to someone who is not Irish, but nonetheless is appropriately referred to tonight, because he wanted to convey a message to the people of the transatlantic world, and it's not getting out otherwise. And that was Russian President Vladimir Putin, who spoke yesterday. And he said, I want ordinary Western people to hear me, too. You are being persistently told that your current difficulties are the result of Russia's hostile actions, and that you have to pay for the efforts to counter the alleged Russian threat from your own pockets. All of that is a lie. The truth is that the problems faced by millions of people in the West are the result of many years of actions by the ruling elite of your respective countries, their mistakes and short-sighted policies and ambitions. This elite is not thinking about how to improve the lives of their citizens in Western countries. They are obsessed with their own self-serving interests and super profits. To reiterate, the whole planet is now paying for the West's ambitions and the West's attempts to maintain its elusive dominance by any means possible. Imposing sanctions is the logical continuation and the distillation of the irresponsible and short-sighted policy of the United States and the European Union countries, governments, and central banks. They themselves have driven up global inflation in recent years, and with their actions caused rising global poverty and greater inequality across the world. The question now arises, who will answer for the millions who will die of hunger in the world's poorest countries due to growing food shortages? Talks a little bit about the illegitimate freezing of some of the currency reserves of the Bank of Russia marks the end of the reliability of the so-called first-class assets. In fact, the United States and the EU have defaulted on their obligations to Russia. Now everybody knows that financial reserves can simply be stolen, and many countries in the immediate future may begin, I am sure that this will happen, to convert their paper and digital assets into real reserves of raw materials, land, food, gold, and other real assets, which will only result in more shortages in these markets. And he continued in that vein, but we wanted to make sure to at least make those matters clear. He said, he's also said, to conclude, we must clearly understand that a new package of sanctions and restrictions would have been imposed on us no matter what. I want to emphasize this. For the West, our military operation in Ukraine is just a pretext for imposing more sanctions on us. To reiterate, these are just pretexts. Policy of containing and weakening Russia, including through economic isolation, a blockade is a premeditated long-term strategy. And he says more, but I would wish to differ. I think that this is a pretext for imposing more sanctions on us, meaning the United States and the European nations, because this is part of something completely different being run by people who are not the West, but are located in a very specific location in the City of London, also Wall Street, which is a sort of subsidiary of the City of London. And they are not being mentioned enough by anybody except us to some degree. We hear about the great game, the new great game between Russia, China, and the United States. We hear about the U.S. versus Russia. We hear about NATO and the U.S. versus Russia. But we don't hear about Great Britain in any of this, though, in fact, they and that Commonwealth, if you want to call it that, that imperial system is at the very center of everything going on. Hence our topic for tonight concerning what we can learn from the Irish. Now, just before we go to that, I want to point out one factor, which was something that we had just come across just a few days ago, which is a discussion, an interview with a German filmmaker by the name of Alexander Kluge. He's 90 years old, and he was interviewed in, I believe, the Die Zeit. And generally speaking, this has not been even referred to. And he was talking about the problem of war. And so the question that was put to him, it looks like we are suddenly back into war in Europe. What do you think of this situation? And he said, they say that if you skate on thin ice, you won't break it if you keep skating as fast as possible. We live in different realities, and they are fragile to each other. It's a sheer misfortune that there's now open war. No one is in control of this. There is not a single value in the world, material or ideal, that justifies war. This does not mean I'm a pacifist. I'm not a preacher of peace. But war is unpredictable. The only thing that remains absolutely uncontrollable is war. Sickness can be cured, but war cannot. And so he goes on like that. There's various elements of this, but there's a very specific thing that he's asked. He's asked, well, what do you suggest? And he says, well, you have to reset the whole apparatus, and on both sides. So the newspaper reporter from Die Zeit says, resetting. What exactly do you mean by that? And he says, well, it may sound remote in the current situation, but you have to go back to the starting point of the confrontation. The alternative to war is an intact security structure, something whole. One must locate the point that allows both sides to reach an understanding. The winner is not who wins the battles. The victor is the one who makes the peace. Let me give you an example. International law came into being around the cities of Münster and Osnabrück in 1648, when an 80-year war between the Netherlands and Spain, and at the same time a 30-year war in Central Europe, were brought to an end in a negotiation process that lasted 5 years. The decisive aspect of this Peace of Westphalia is the establishment of the so-called normal year. It was agreed that the Protestant and Catholic estates, they were the primary warring parties, should remain or be restored as they were on January 1st, 1624. That's 24 years earlier. This is the point of intersection of the pain line for all parties, the only time in the 30 Years' War when one side had not won more than the other. The point is equidistant for all parties to the conflict from their desires. This point is the small possibility space. Finding and negotiating this possibility space was the key to peace. And he goes on like that to say various things. They ask him this, well, what does this mean in relationship to the war in Ukraine? And he said, well, first of all, no politics or speech of self-certainty. In the current debate, each side, each body claims to have the overview. But there is no such thing. We speak with the great war theorist Clausewitz of the fog of war. As soon as war breaks out, everything is indeterminate. The nebulousness, this indeterminacy, is the challenge to which we have to respond. And that is why we cannot win any security structure with psychologizing Putin or with a moral stance that we all share in the West. The malice is well distributed on both sides. He said, don't get me wrong, I am not indifferent on any issue. I judge very well. I love freedom and self-determination. But I know that I am not the ruler. My base of judgment is, where would be the point, even for a madman or an evil one, where he can agree on the basis of reality? And so he just continues in that way. But this idea of the Peace of Westphalia being actually raised by someone other than the Helga Zepp-LaRouche, particularly in Germany, is of note and is the basis of our call for the conference, probably being held on April 9th, perhaps April 23rd, but more hopefully on April 9th, to discuss the contents of our petition that is now being circulated on convoking a conference to establish a new security and development architecture for the world. So now to the topic. We take this topic up not merely because St. Patrick's Day affords us the occasion, but because we need to learn something from some people who have recognized continually that there is one primary source of evil from the time that Venice transmitted its disease, its virus of monetarism to Amsterdam and to London, and that is the city of London. And so we want to take this up not merely from the standpoint of identifying that, but identifying also the culturally optimistic outlook that can accompany the Peace of Westphalia approach that we are talking about, which is informed by a concept of economics that Lyndon LaRouche perfected, but which is also known as the American system of Alexander Hamilton and the great patriots Matthew Carey and Henry Carey, both of them of Irish descent, but they were the architects of, particularly Henry Carey, the so-called Transcontinental Railroad, and then what Lynn later called and referred to as the Eurasian Land Bridge, the inspirers of what happened in Germany with Friedrich List and the railroads and the Zollverein, the customs unions formed there, and the inspiration for what was done in Russia with the Trans-Siberian Railroad and so forth. So to discuss this as a whole, not merely any of the particulars of what I've said, but the concept as a whole, we have Marcia Baker. And Marcia, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Dennis, and greetings and blessings to everyone on St. Patrick's Day. And I will pick up on what you were saying about the prospect. We're glad to hear that we will definitely be having a conference maybe as early as April 9th, a very good thing, if not soon after Easter. And as you said, many people, and I'm sure many people new or a long time on this phone call, have been involved in organizing for support for bringing about a new security and development architecture. So I'm going to address the security side of things, which always involves development, in a very simple, straightforward way. When it comes to security, and you mentioned this historically at the time of the 1600s, there's a military aspect. We have to absolutely not be attacking and killing each other. And then there's, let me call it the means to life aspect. That is, to live, to be alive, we have to have the basics: food, water, not freezing to death, not overheating, medical treatment is the best that you can have at that time. So on this means to life aspect, I just want to bring out a few things, because you mentioned the concept of international law in the most profound sense, that it should serve the common interests of nations, of peoples, and further our existence and future existence. So I'll just say in passing, on the military side, we're encountering, aren't we, when we talk to people and they just want to jump up and down and say, well, you have to take a stand. Russia has invaded Ukraine, and many people who want, I mean, naturally the suffering and death that's involved in that is something you don't want, but they don't credit at all that there's any history, any complexity, anything that was leading up to this. So they're really saying there should be a different kind of international law for different nations, because the U.S., NATO, and Britain look at what's been happening in recent years. While they're saying they support, they usually say rules-based law, not international law, they've been invading Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Afghanistan. There was an effort to try for Kazakhstan. That's another story, but didn't succeed. So you can't have different interpretations of international law or something that's profoundly important for everyone. And the same thing goes when it comes to not military matters as such, but the means to life and security. So the simple concept I want to bring out, and we'll get to the lessons and the inspiration from Ireland, is that we, in recent decades, when we had the kind of invasions I'm talking about, and not building up nations at all, tearing them down, we have had a deliberate a kind of military economic monopoly complex, an economic monopoly functioning internationally, that when it comes to food, infrastructure for water, medicine, and so forth, they have absolutely been against nations and peoples. Let me identify what we're talking about. You know the word big pharma, and some of the famous names, Bayer or Bayer, you call it, GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer. I mean, they have functioned in a way in many, many nations that were strictly profiteering or worse, and they were just wings of, or units, subunits of the London Wall Street financial access for profiteering and for not against development. You have the famous name big food processors, Danone or Nestle's or Kraft Heinz or PepsiCo, likewise functioning in dozens of nations internally over and above their governments. And you've also had what you could call big agro, it's often called. The famous names, usually the same as big pharma in the chemical sphere, that control fertilizers, or that control seeds that you need to plant for your crops, chemicals that you need to protect those crops against bugs and weeds and worms and things like that. And these famous names include, like, Bayer Crop Science, they bought Monsanto, includes Cargill, includes Pioneer DuPont, Dow Chemical, DeKalb. A notable exception, we'll say in passing, is some of these companies that have operated in China, however, have had to obey the Chinese government, whereas elsewhere in the world, Australia or the Americas or Canada and the U.S., they obey only Wall Street and London. And same goes for some of the famous name fertilizer companies. Cargill's one, they own most of Mosaic. The big famous one in Norway is called Yara. And the Canadian one, the biggest in the world, it's based in Canada, but it's transnational. It's called Nutrien. So you've had this apparatus, like a military economic monopoly apparatus that has presided before the pandemic, before the latest Ukraine situation, in a way that you've had over 800 million people out of the world's nearly 8 billion people in a permanent state of insufficient food. We have about 40 or more million people really starving to death, at the point of starvation. Afghanistan, the Congo, Yemen, Caribbean. You've had 300 million are on the way. So the reason I raise that is this was already the case. And now, for just an historical reference, and then we can take things up in discussion, what I've just described is like a modernized template of what we fought a revolution against. That is the British Empire. And you had the British East India Company itself, which has its own history, but you had monopolies. You know, by the way, that senator who really doesn't do anything from the upper Midwest, Amy Klobuchar, wrote a book called Antitrust. She says, in her view, her research, there were 700 monopolies at the time of the American Revolution under the British Empire. The tea concession, the indigo concession, the wheat concession, the opium poppy concession, you know, that kind of thing. And they did do the ordering for colonies or non-colonies of who could eat and who had to buy what, or that kind of thing. And, the labels later came to be known as, you could buy strawberry jam by appointment to the king or queen. But this was all backed up by military, by show trial courts. And so take a specific example. You had a situation where you had the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, as it was called, in the early 1800s, where this British system of monopolies controlled the trade and production. And you had a situation in Ireland where there were the large English landowners that would be producing for export what they chose to produce, and including grain or meat, and those compelled to work on these plantations, these large holdings, the Catholic Irelanders would have a small plot and have to rely on subsistence backyard potatoes, and bang, in 1845, I think, was the time that fungus-type blight showed up. And Phytophthora infestans, which I understand from our expert Paul Gallagher had hit earlier in the Americas and made its way around the world, but half the crop in 1845 was rotted or affected by the blight. There was no alternative, but of course you could have eaten alternative foodstuffs that were otherwise being exported, whether it was fish or whether it was dairy or something like that, or grain. But this arrangement wasn't made at all. And while this blight continued, I think for the next 7 years, taking half or more, you just couldn't defeat it at the time, of the potatoes, over 1 million people, I think, died directly or indirectly because of malnutrition. They got other things. 1 million people were left, and we can get into that more, but this was done. You had the means to make substitutions, to make arrangements, to have peas, beans, other things were grown. None of it was done. So you had this terrible loss of life, terrible suffering, and the situation in principle is the same today. If we're going to be talking, when we want to talk about security, when it comes to food security and development, we are faced with this evil system of these monopolies and this outlook that tolerates and furthers them and runs them and has forced them through the governments of different nations. This is the end of the line. We need a new framework. Now we'll just come to full stop to where we are today, although I can't help but mention in the 1900s, the famous famine that took place, called the Bengal famine, 1943, in what's eastern India and what's now Bangladesh. 3 million people, I think, at that 1 year, as many as that, or at least 2.5, died out of 60 million in that region, because there was a food shortage, but food was being exported to Europe. It was not redirected to save lives. And Churchill's often quoted, and for all I know, it's a right. If he didn't say it, he would have. He said, "The famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits. I hate Indians. They're a beastly people with a beastly religion." Churchill has a way with words. But anyway, I said that we'd come back to today. The point is if you already have a system where these transnationals, I'm simplifying it, but they are running things and presiding over insufficient food in a large part of the world, and determining some places as source regions for production, like the U.S. soybean belt or the Brazilian and Paraguay soybean belt. There's different things. But if they control seeds, if they control all this, and then you have a certain development. Now that's where, say, Ukraine, with this situation, Ukraine and Russia together in that Black Sea area north of there have been a tremendous breadbasket to the world. And that's one of the black earth wheat belts of the world. It also is wonderful for corn and for oil seeds like sunflower or others. So of the 200 million metric tons each year in recent years of wheat that was exported, that region accounted for 30%. Now, the shipping isn't taking place of the remaining grain that hasn't yet been shipped out, and there's other things not happening. You're getting the Western sanctions on fertilizer that also is from the northern part of this region in Belarus. They have tremendous potassium deposits that had been shipped out to everywhere in the world. So you have, well, all I want to say without going through the detail, there's tremendous disruption. There's a big gap, a food gap this year. Now, it's possible through redirection on a world scale, not just in Ireland in 1845 or 1850, but in a world scale. What you'd want to do is make best use of where you know there is food, even if it is wheat. It isn't wheat, if it's something else, something that will keep people alive. Nations should get together. It's part of a security mandate and help decide and make happen the redirection. India has, fortunately, an exportable surplus of maybe 7 million tons. So if you have a gap, which we do, of about 20 million tons of wheat this year, India might make up some of it. Where should it go? It'd be good to go to the most dependent, import-dependent nations of the world. There are 15 nations in the world that are well over 50% dependent on wheat from Russia and Ukraine that aren't getting it. They include big ones like Egypt, but they also include Morocco, they include Libya, Tunisia. This could be figured out and would save lives. The principle involved is just the opposite of what happened to Ireland. Figure out how to save lives. That's why nations should collaborate, and not just for this year, but you have the coming crop year, 2023, 2024, that you want to line up the fertilizer, the seeds, and all that kind of thing. Now, what I want to say is none of that is really happening in this kind of situation where you have the president of the United States yesterday being induced, I guess, to say Putin is a war criminal. You certainly don't have the disposition being shown in this kind of stuff out of Boris Johnson in London and out of all the rest to figure out how to save lives. And so what we're seeing is what not to do. We're seeing the British Empire evil policy in action, letting people die. Now, others following me can describe how the Irish, I won't say the Fighting Irish, that gets into sports analogies, but we can solve this. It doesn't it doesn't have to play out to the tune of dozens of millions of people automatically dying. But what I've done is laid out the stakes in this in just one aspect, which of course is fundamental to security, which is namely our daily bread. And any detail anyone wants, we've been putting in the EIR or elsewhere, we can talk about in the discussion. But I end with just one thing. Absolutely, the idea of saving lives, not standing by and creating conditions where they're going to be lost, calls the question on the green agenda. And so far, it's been dismal in the official corridors of power. I'll give you an example. A week ago, Wednesday, in Europe, there was a European Union-wide meeting on the food security question, which they have a new mechanism they created a year ago. It's the first time they ever used it. And I want to describe what happened. The farmer organizations from Europe, the umbrella organization, said we have to have help. We need We need help to line up fertilizers, fuel. We have to be able to plant the crop this spring. We have to have intervention, and we need some of these Green Deal farm to fork restrictions lifted on what we're allowed to do, or we're going to have a huge food shortage. The nation of Spain, Cyprus, the little one, Greece, others asked, we need livestock feed. We got it from the Black Sea. We don't have it now. By Easter, we are going to run out of livestock feed for our meat animals. Others said other things. What did the European Union leadership say? Sorry, it's climate in the Mediterranean that has been so dry that's causing our basic problems. So despite whatever's happening as a disruption in Ukraine, we have to reduce emissions. We will not change anything about the Green Deal farm to fork, which, by the way, said by 2030, land should be cut by 10% out of agriculture use. Farm chemicals for weeds, to prevent weeds and bugs, should be cut by 50%. They had a whole list of cuts, which means cutting food. Now, 2 days later, they had to give in. Spain announced they're going to be allowed to import some livestock feed, which they weren't allowed under the Green New Deal because it had some traces of chemicals. So they're going to import it from the United States. So this is a hand-to-hand combat thing, but our own role in knowing that what we're up against and the extent of it, and it's the same evil we've seen in these historic examples, arms us to do what we can, I'm sure. So I'll leave it at that. And I hope others will fill in the picture of Ireland, and especially some of the positive news about in this fight. What we're really talking about is we have to restore sovereignty to our governments and nations again and take actions in the interests of the people, the general welfare. That's it.
Okay, thanks a lot, Marcia. We are going to continue. We have two other persons that are going to be presenting. Rick Sanders is first, and Paul Gallagher.
Okay. Well, what I'm hoping for is a denazification of the British Empire. And I think we have a chance because Putin certainly has the right idea with the denazification of Ukraine, but they're just small potatoes compared to the British Empire and its modern incarnation. They make Hitler look like a piker, and besides that, we know they put him into power. They gave him the money, they gave him everything, gave him Czechoslovakia, etc. So, but I just want to give you three kind of pegs to look at this situation. One is the Bengal famine of 1770, and then the next famine I want to look at is Ireland in 1847, and then another Bengal famine in 1943 during the Second World War. And that will give you a picture of the continuity. There is no difference between these people who ran the East India Company and did what they did in India, and Tony Blair, who sent George Bush to murder 1 million people in Iraq. There's absolutely no difference. So it's good to know what they're up to. And in fact, they have, of course, written history. Most people don't know almost anything about this. And we're in the process already of changing that. LaRouche, of course, got it started. But we ain't quitting until the right people are behind bars and at least made totally impotent or spit out, as Putin said, like insects. So just to, I know Marcia already said something about the Bengal famine. Just to give you an idea, this actually helped to set off the American Revolution because it was so horrible, it was so unbelievable that eyewitnesses came and told us here in America in 1771. In parentheses, As long as the British ruled India, there were at least 12 huge famines. Since independence, there have been none. So that should give you a picture. So news of the Bengal famine reached here in 1771 with various letters. And I'm going to read a little bit of what one of these letters said by a man who wrote a book about it, John Fiske, called American Philosopher in the Unseen World. All through the stifling summer of 1770, the people went on dying. The husbandmen sold their cattle. They sold their implements of agriculture. They devoured their seed grain. They sold their sons and daughters, till at length no buyer of children could be found. They ate the leaves of trees and the grass of the field. And in June 1770, the resident at Dunbar affirmed that the living were feeding on the dead. Day and night, a torrent of famished and disease-stricken wretches poured into the great cities. The streets were blocked up with promiscuous heaps of the dying and dead. Interment could not do its work quick enough. Even the dogs and jackals, the public scavengers of the East, became unable to accomplish their revolting work, and a multitude of mangled and festering corpses at length threatened the existence of the citizens. So, that was to us. That was a wake-up call for us. So, a series of pamphlets were written called The Alarm, and the man writing under the name of Rusticus invoked the famine in India perpetrated by the British East India Company, imploring, "Are we in like manner to be given up to the disposal of the East India Company, who have now the assurance to step forth in aid of the minister to execute his plan of enslaving America? Their conduct in Asia for some years past has given simple proof how little they regard the laws of nations, the rights, liberties, or lives of men. They have levied war, excited rebellion, dethroned lawful princes, and sacrificed millions for the sake of gain. The revenues of mighty kingdoms have entered in their coffers, and these not being sufficient to glut their avarice, they have, by the most unparalleled barbarities, extortions, and monopolies, stripped the miserable inhabitants of their property and reduced whole provinces to indigence and ruin. 1,500,000, it is said, perished by famine in 1 year, not because the earth denied its fruit, but because this company and their servants engulfed all the necessaries of life and set them at so high a rate that the poor could not purchase them." Then he says to the American people, "Resolve, therefore, nobly resolve, and publish the world your resolutions, that no man will receive the tea, no man will let his stores or suffer the vessel that brings it to moor at his wharf, and that if any person assists at unloading, landing, or storing it, he shall ever after be deemed an enemy to this country and never be employed by his fellow citizens." And that's just prior to the Boston Tea Party. So this was ironic that we actually woke up because of this terrible thing. And it's just the way the British do things. There's nothing accidental about it. It's not a question of drought or bad management or any of that crazy stuff they're always saying. It is the British system. So now coming to Ireland in the 1840s, there were many previous, but this was one of the worst and that we remember. There were, at the time, Ireland had 9 million people. Today, they still only have 6.5 million. So 3 million people were forced to leave or died or left, and I believe the mortality on those ships was about 50%, something like that. And then they died in camps in Canada or here or Australia when they arrived there because they already had many diseases. So, and one aspect of this, which is not very well known is the question of clearances, which they did in Ireland and in Scotland, where they simply cleared. It's what it sounds like. They cleared the people off the land. These people were tenant farmers, and they were managing somehow or another. And but the British decided that they wanted to put sheep there or deer, or return them to its natural state. Ever hear of that? And so they just made things so horrible, so impossible for them, with either taxes or overworking them, that they were forced off the land and had no choice except to try to leave, which was already a desperate thing, or else die. And they carried out the most unbelievable atrocities, just attacking women and children with bayonets, and just throwing children up in the air and catching them on their bayonets, stuff like that. This is their form of entertainment. And that's how they still think today. And then, the people who are buying up our real estate, our houses, and then renting them out for twice as much as before to the poor suckers who were thrown out, their mentality is exactly the same. And as long as we know it and we expose it, then we can beat them. So, and of course, John Kennedy was very strong on food for peace, and he knew how to solve this thing, and he was going against Malthus. But and then now let me come to the Bengal of 1943. This is one that people don't know very well. First of all, they said, as usual, they said it was a drought. But recently in India, they've done some studies of 150 years of drought data. There was no drought. So, however, what the British did, is they increased taxes as usual and prices and so forth, and they stopped rice imports. And a similar thing happened in the 1770s. They were not allowed to stockpile rice, or stockpile, that is, keep it in your cupboard so that in case of the crop failure, you'd have something to eat. They call that stockpiling and hoarding. But in this case, they stopped rice imports. And the Japanese had occupied Burma in 1942, which then cut off the supplies. But the British prioritized, as you would expect, distribution of vital supplies to the military, civil servants, and other priority classes. Winston Churchill, the fraudulent, one of the biggest criminals of World War II, he personally oversaw the exporting of food from Bengal to European stockpiles, not because people were hungry, but because maybe a little while from now they might get hungry and we might need it for the liberated Greeks and Yugoslavs and so forth. But that's what he did, and an estimated 3 million people died there. So, and then to come, you probably when I was talking, you got some echoes about Afghanistan, the famine going on there, people selling their children. It's the same thing, and the same indifference that has been created by them that we have to break people out of is exactly what's happening. And now Biden and company and the crew here, basically since the assassination of JFK, they act more and more like the British Empire every day. And then one of their Green spokesmen is Klaus Schwab. I believe he said, you won't, like maybe a few years from now, if the Green policy succeeds, you won't own anything, but you'll be happy. So, of course, you'll be happy as long as they give you dope and as long as they give you a little pittance, but they can turn the tap on and off whenever they want. So I want to end with, for the moment, with quoting the Queen of England's historian, Queen Victoria's historian, who accompanied her to Ireland in 1850 to see how wonderful that part of the empire was doing. His name is Charles Kingsley, and here's what he said when they got to Ireland. I am daunted by the human chimpanzees I saw along that 100 miles of horrible country. I don't believe they are our fault. I believe that there are not only many more of them than of old, but that they are happier, better, and more comfortably fed and lodged under our rule than they ever were. But to see white chimpanzees is dreadful. If they were black, one would not feel it so much.
Okay, Rick, that seems to be a relatively accurate report. All right, and I believe that Paul's with us. Let me also just point out one thing. If you've just joined us, we are in the middle of our St. Patrick's Day reflections on the reality of the agency behind thermonuclear war, World War III particularly. We're talking about what can be learned from the Irish. I just want to reference so people know concerning this business about Biden and the war criminal business around saying this thing about Putin, which was being instigated by the press. There's a reason for this, which is that by getting Biden on record declaring Putin to be a war criminal, the idea is that the President of the United States, both by tradition and it could also be even by legislative mandate under certain circumstances, is not supposed to speak to war criminals. That the idea is, in other words, to try to get something stated, which of course you know you can get Biden to do under certain circumstances, that would argue that he should not be talking directly to Putin. And so remember the earlier descriptions of Biden that you were hearing about his incompetence, his lapses, essentially his senility, or that, or the supposed senility. So keep that in mind, because the entirety of what we are living through, and this is our basic point to everybody, is a manipulation on the part of the usual people that do it, which is the British intelligence, City of London, Wall Street, Nexus. So, Paul, are you with us now? I think I see you there. Hey, can you hear us, Paul?
Yes, I just wanted to get off speaker. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, you're okay now. Fine. Go right ahead.
Well, a lot has been said, but in terms of the alternative, I mean, the problem that's posed here, you have nations today which are in Africa in particular, and Marcia could certainly say more about this from her own work with regard to Mozambique, for example. You have nations which are exporting large amounts of food while starving, as Ireland was in the 1840s and the early 1850s. And there has to be an alternative. Now, in Ireland, the alternative arose 100 years earlier, in the middle of the 18th century, mainly in the person of Dean Jonathan Swift, Dean of St. Paul's in Dublin, who, of course, is known for his novels like Gulliver, and he's known for this extremely nasty satire of the Malthusians that he did called A Modest Proposal, which was the proposal that the overpopulation and food problems be solved simultaneously by eating the babies. And he was a wit which the British feared. He knew them very well. He worked among and against some of their sharpest statesmen, so-called, in the 18th century. And he, in Ireland, became the driving force of a movement in which he summed up in the command, burn everything English except their coal. And this was a movement that he organized for the development of the domestic economic sectors of the Irish economy in order to stand the country up as a country capable of producing decent life for its inhabitants. And one of the pillars of that was that the Irish should mine and produce their own coal. Another was that they should produce their own textiles and linens, which was an industry that did grow up from the 1750s to the 1780s, around the port of Belfast in particular. Another was that they should build their own shipping so that they could carry their trade in their own bottoms. That also centered around the port of Belfast. And there were other industries which Swift's genius gave impetus to. His genius was that he was both brilliant, and there are, of course, many Irish revolutionaries who one could say were brilliant, but he had the distinction in that he was also judicious, and his judiciousness was that he was not counseling. He was counseling against violence, against the what the Irish constantly called their risings, which were invariably unsuccessful. But rather that they needed to do the hard work, especially against British imperial overlords, the hard work of actually building their own economic capabilities. And his impetus led in 1782 to the formation of the first and the adoption of the first sovereign constitution that Ireland had ever had. And this was accomplished with the aid of a militia which had been organized, which was called the United Irishmen, which was also a first in that it was equally composed of Protestant and Catholic Irish people. And it was a political movement which included a militia, but it was primarily a political movement, the United Irish. And it was after the death of Swift, it was under the direct eye, at least some of the time, of Benjamin Franklin, who spent time in Scotland and also visited and spent time sitting in the newly constitutional Parliament of Ireland and observing and advising the proceedings. And you could say that Jonathan Swift had been the Benjamin Franklin of Ireland. So this constitution and the United Irish movement essentially made Ireland independent for the first time, although it was brief. And it's interesting that, to us in particular, that 1782, when the Irish Constitution was adopted, was just 1 year prior. It was 1 year after the effective defeat of the British, with the surrender of Cornwallis here. And, of course, Cornwallis later became a Lord Lieutenant of Ireland when he was kind of a used-up person. They gave him that job. But there was his defeat in 1781. There was the Irish Constitution in 1782, and then the Treaty of Paris, ending the War of Independence of the Americans in 1783. So these things happened at exactly the same time, and the leaders involved were very much in contact with each other, and actually some of them going back and forth between Ireland and the United States. And this is where the famous Matthew Carey comes in, because he twice emigrated, the second time was chased out of Ireland as a revolutionary. But what happened was, in the United States, William Pitt the Younger became the British Prime Minister, and his approach to both of these apparently successful revolutions against the British Empire, the Irish and the American, was the same, and that was to make free trade treaties with them and tried to overwhelm their economies with British free trade. In the case of the United States, the period of the Confederacy in America, the leading revolutionaries immediately began to suspect that this was being done to them, and that this intermediate weak national government which they had formed in 1782, 1783 was inadequate and had to be replaced by a strong federal government which was capable of taking in hand the economic development of the country against the British. And they did that. And George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, from the already 1784, 1785, were already leaders of this plan to change the government to a strong federal government. The Irish, unfortunately, allowed themselves to be lulled into doing the opposite, essentially not having an executive at all. Their executive continued to be King George III of England, but having only an independent parliament under their constitution. And William Pitt the Younger was able to get around them over the period of 20 years, 1782 to 1804, and by 1804, the Irish Constitution had been overthrown by what was called the English Act of Union of 1804, whereby Ireland again lost its sovereignty and became a part of merely a region of the British Empire. And from that point on, the accomplishments and the progress of the Swiftian period in Ireland, the second half of the 18th century, began to go downhill toward the eventual disaster of the famine that Rick described. So it was in that period that Matthew Carey twice came to the United States, the second time as a fugitive, and he formed an organization, he was really the leader in forming an organization initially in New Jersey, which was called, guess what, the United Irishmen. And he went on to be the leading publisher and seller of books of all kinds in America, and was that for decades. He was the biggest publisher, the publisher of all the most important works, and also the distributor through bookstores and other means around the growing states of the United States. He had a tremendous influence, even aside from the influence on Abraham Lincoln of his son, Henry Carey, later in that century. So this really, this was the alternative, and it permeated not only in Ireland in the second half of the 18th century, but also in the United States. And its essence was sovereignty against British imperial domination. So not to try to go into any detailed history, it's interesting now that the Irish are now in Ulster, in the Northern Ireland, 6 counties, are now a part of the migration out of the United Kingdom, which is also involving the Scots. The Brexit of Boris Johnson did not work for Northern Ireland, for Ulster at all. The so-called Irish backstop to the Brexit has been a disaster for the people of Northern Ireland. So you now have a situation where in 1973 they took a vote called the border poll, or sometimes called the unity poll, to a referendum in both sides, the Republic of Ireland and also in the Northern Irish counties. They took a vote as to whether they should be united or whether the Ulster counties were going to be part of the UK. And the vote went overwhelmingly for division, so that they were, the Ulster counties, the 6 counties were, and have been since then, part of the UK. But in exactly 25 years later, in 1998, was the Good Friday Agreement, which not only ended the violence, the so-called Troubles, the constant violence between the Protestants and the Catholics in Northern Ireland, around Derry in particular. It ended that, but it also, the Good Friday Agreement was full of language embracing the future potential unity of Ireland. And now we are 25 years later again, or we will be next year, next May 2023, will be the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. So with the great dissatisfaction that the people of Northern Ireland now have with the so-called Brexit and the Boris Johnson so-called Irish backstop, dealing with the trade and investment across the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. With all of that great dissatisfaction, which is reported to us by many people, it were the case that if a new unity poll or a new border poll, as it might be called, were to be held next May, and there is a movement of people who want it to be held next May on the 50th anniversary of the last border poll, then it's quite likely that the Irish North and South would vote to unify in an Irish Republic, which would be outside the UK. And at the same time, as everyone knows, the Scots are trying to exit from the UK as well. So this is definitely something to be looked forward to, because that's the issue of sovereignty, again, over against the British imperial geopolitics and British imperial domination.
Okay, thanks a lot, Paul. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a couple of questions. We may be a little bit more limited than normal in that, and I have one questioner that called in on my line, knowing that that is the way to do it. So if you're there, go ahead and state your question, and then I have another matter which was texted to me, which I'm going to also take up. So go ahead.
Hello, hi. Can I be heard okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, hi. My name is Jose Vega. I'm from New York. I wanted to ask a question about what Lynn exactly meant when he talks about kicking over the grand chessboard. Because of various activities that I've been doing around local politics here in New York, on many different fronts, especially elections, we get a runaround. And I often get told from people who are staff members or even from local politicians themselves, listen, you really can't do much. You have to go through the system in order to get things done. You have to get so-and-so to sponsor you because it looks bad if this party supports this over another party. And so, sorry, that's just the way politics is. And I know Lynn would not accept that, and I'm sure all the presenters here would never accept an answer like that. So, but what does that mean exactly when you have an authority or a so-called authority who does not listen to you and does not have the courage to actually stand up for what is right, but instead says, well, what do other people think about it? What exactly then should be my role when it comes to not just exposing that, but also being the agent for the change I want to see? And how does that relate to kicking over the chessboard as a whole? So,
okay, but before anybody answers, let me just point out to everybody listening that the grand chessboard, however, refers to a plagiarization by Zbigniew Brzezinski of another idea, which is called the Great Game. And it's relevant to our discussions very specifically because the way the United States got to Afghanistan was through the British. The reason we've been there for 40 years, not 20 years, 40 years, is because of Bernard Lewis, British intelligence agent Bernard Lewis, and his epigony, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Also because of Henry Kissinger's relationship to British intelligence, which he confessed to 40 years ago in May of 1982, when he stated that in his incarnation at the State Department, he kept the British Foreign Office better informed than he kept the State Department. He stated that explicitly at a meeting celebrating the 200th anniversary of the founding of British intelligence at Chatham House in England. Finally, just point out that the Iraq War also came directly from Tony Blair's dodgy dossier, which was believed, ostensibly, at least used, by George W. Bush to get us into that war. And that what we are looking at in Ukraine is actually no different because a lot of this involves not only Christopher Steele, who happens to be specifically involved, but it involves British intelligence capabilities on the ground in Ukraine, both in terms of the terrorist capabilities, that is the fascist capabilities there, and possibly this biochemical warfare business that has yet to be determined. Just wanted to say that, and just like to ask... let me ask Marcia if she has an answer for you, followed by Paul and then Rick.
Yeah, I'll just say something. Hi, Jose, because I concur with what was just said about the certain specific meaning about the great game associated with Brzezinski, and before that, these hoary geopolitical figures, the British guys, Mon and other people, and so that the great chessboard can refer to just moving around forces, one nation to another, as if it's all a game, and specifically in Eurasia, to keep the place bleeding, to make sure Britain's on top by pitting, say, in the so-called Middle East, different nations, or redrawing boundaries, playing people off against each other. But that can be addressed again. I just want to say one thing, though, Jose, that the kinds of things you're describing, there's also the pipsqueak game, which is you bring up something fundamental, as I understand you've been doing, the question of urban infrastructure. People are dying for lack of water management, and people died from the floods, from fires, from not. So you bring up something serious, and then you get people in office, and they just give you the runaround as you just described. Well, you have to understand how things work. You can't really go at it frontally. You have to cultivate connections. What a lot of pipsqueak game crap. So therefore, so I'm just saying that I wouldn't even elevate it. It doesn't reach the level of this other deadly stuff, but it's all deadly. And you could give concrete examples. One that just, I'm sorry, I'm oriented to the food crisis right now. But you take something like Haiti after the earthquake in 2010, and then it subsequently had the earthquake and floods and typhoons. And there was a specific situation. Haiti's in the Caribbean. It's potentially very productive, but it's been, it has mangoes and all kinds of things. So what happened is you have a situation where Haiti needs basic foods, but after the 2010 earthquake, the Clintons and Bush and everybody come in and say, here's what we should do. We'll help you in your participation in world markets. You will give money to Coca-Cola, and they can help you produce more mangoes, and you can have mango pulp and sell that in the U.S., and that'll help you rebuild after the earthquake. This is just warmed over British famine type BS. But anyone you talk to anyone, you say, well, you have to be realistic. You should go along with that. You can't develop Haiti's agriculture. You can't develop infrastructure in New York. You can't do it. It's just pipsqueak stuff. It's just completely wrong. And the best way is you go after principles and say what we're really going to do. Paul mentioned this when it comes to what happened in Ireland, where Ireland was exporting food by order of the British while people were starving. Name countries. I mentioned Haiti. They're exporting mango pulp. And Kenya is exporting flowers to Europe. South Africa's exporting grapefruit to the United States when you grow it in Florida or Texas. This thing is a mess, and we're now in a potential role to override it all. And so that's what we need to do. That's what I say.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was muted. I didn't mute myself. Paul, I was asking if you had anything.
Well, only that the kicking over the chessboard, in the sense that you brought it up, Dennis, of Zbigniew Brzezinski's grand chessboard, this is what we're doing right now with the call for an international conference for a new strategic architecture based on LaRouche's economic policies, and the petition, the use of that call as a petition, because the grand chessboard, if Brzezinski wanted to call it that way, rather than the great game, the point of it for long decades and decades has always been the same. We are destroying Russia. It's always been the British imperial elite saying, this is how we're destroying Russia. That objective hasn't changed. The rise of China, the peaceful rise of China, has become part of it, but the invariant from the 19th century days of Afghanistan to the development of the Al-Qaeda and the jihadis in the 1980s to now, with the forcing of Russia into war over Ukraine, it's always been to destroy Russia. Our response to it, from the Schiller Institute to the British saying we are destroying Russia, is we say we are building a new strategic architecture based on LaRouche's policies and economics, and thereby we are destroying the British Empire. We are destroying the city of London over a period of time. So that's our flank against your 100-year attempt to seize domination over Russia and or destroy it. We are building the kind of strategic and economic architecture, a new international monetary system as well, which will destroy the influence of the British Empire, and in that sense, kick over their chessboard.
Okay. It might be... Rick, do you have anything?
I do.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Well, Jose, first of all, chess is a pretty bad game because you're always trying to murder the king, you know. We have to study poetry. For example, Percy Shelley was 19 years old. He just got married to his 16-year-old wife, and for their honeymoon, they went to Ireland to agitate against the British, and they did a really good job. All the crickets, as I call them, all the Shelley industry, they always ridicule it and say he was, he didn't know what he was doing, he was young, this and that. But in fact, he was electrifying people with his direct appeal just for normal things like forming circles for reading and having Catholic emancipation. those very simple, straightforward. He laid it all out and caused a total sensation. The British decided that they were going to revoke habeas corpus, and so that he could have been, and anybody could have been arrested and thrown in a dungeon forever. So he had to leave. But they were freaked out, and they continued to shadow him and so forth. But it was because he was inspiring people with poetry. Now, some lunkhead that you run into may not respond to that, but maybe people around them will respond to that, and the lunkhead can, stay there and rot or whatever. But I think that inspires people, and we can learn from Shelley and others. And in fact, I should mention this, that in India, Gandhi used to read and his people used to read the Mask of Anarchy many a time before their meetings, which Shelley wrote about the horrible things the massacre that the British carried out. So we don't know, but certainly without having Shelley to Shelley's voice, they might not have been as successful as they were.
I think Jose has a response, and I also have something, a special present for Jose from somebody that died a couple years ago named Peregrine Worsthorne. I'll reference this here just so everybody hears it. It was something that was covered at the time back in 1989. He wrote an editorial which Mark Birdman of our intelligence staff at that time covered. And in his editorial, he says the following, so that we're clear about and he was a member of the Tory party. I think he was a lord, I'm not certain. But he said the following: the survival of the fittest is not a popular phrase these days. It is associated with eugenics, social Darwinism, and other nasty things. But all that it implies is an ability to adapt to the changing environment and the quality most in need of emphasizing in the mass consumer societies of today, more than brawn and even more than brain, is self-control. Market economics were never at the center of Margaret Thatcher's creed. At the center was, and increasingly is, the view that society and the state can do no greater service to people, particularly ordinary people, than to encourage them at every stage in the virtues of self-control, and no greater disservice than to promote the virtues of compassion and caring at the expense of the old Victorian values. This is a lesson too late for the doomed blacks in the Bronx to learn, but not too late for those other recently emancipated people in Eastern Europe whose need for it is even more dire than our own. Okay, that's a little present for you. But go ahead if you have a response to what people were saying.
Yeah, well, actually I thought more about my response. I was going to ask a question about the poetry because, in the play Much Ado About Nothing, the person who ultimately delivers justice and mercy is the king who comes back from his sabbatical. And he was watching everything from behind the scenes, watching all the injustice happen. And so originally I was going to say, well, isn't that a way of Shakespeare saying that ultimately at the end of the day, you have to go to a higher authority in order to get justice and get what's right? But upon listening to your response and what you were just reading to me, I have realized that if it weren't for the characters like Isabella who are making noise about this to begin with and trying to plead with somebody about what's happening, or even Mariana asking for mercy, that the events would not have played out the way they did, or even at the end of Beethoven's Fidelio, right? It is because people are in the pursuit of justice that a higher authority is called upon and does respond to the pleas of what is right. So I guess I kind of just answered my own question there.
Okay, well, very good. What we're going to do is, because of our new setup, rather than try to experiment and find various people who may have questions, I think we're just going to hold up. I will invite people to be with us, however, on Saturday. Harley Slanger will be with us then, and we'll be continuing that discussion that we began on Westphalia on Saturday. But what I'd like to do is just take some summary things, if there's anything that people haven't said. Oh, and there's one thing, I'm sorry, I meant to do before, returning to the Irish theme, and we talked a bit about the Careys, Matthew Carey and Henry Carey, but I want to refer to Congressman William Kelly. He was a congressman. He was from Pennsylvania, and I think it's called Pig Iron Kelly as well. And when he gave a speech, this was in 1867, he gave this speech in Alabama. It was after the war, Civil War, the War of the Rebellion, and he was making 2 points to his audience. And these audiences were integrated audiences, black and white. And he said this to the Southerners. He said, "It is therefore in the interest of our country that I speak when I ask you how you use the advantages with which nature has so bounteously provided you. And I tell you that you have impoverished yourselves by treating them with contempt. We turn our coal and iron to most profitable account," meaning we of the North. "You permit yours to slumber in their native earth. Availing ourselves of their power, one man with us does the work of 100 with you. One little girl tending a machine in a factory will spin or weave more cotton in a day than one of your women will in a year by the ancient method of the wheel and hand loom still in use among you. You have not deemed your mineral wealth worthy of consideration. In your devotion to your peculiar system of labor," meaning slavery, "you have forgotten that iron and coal are the most potent agents of modern civilization. Mere muscular power has become a thing of secondary consideration. Iron is the muscles of modern civilization, and coal, ignited coal, fire, is the nervous force that animates it." And that's what he had to say in Montgomery. In New Orleans, it was the same tour, he referenced the war which had just ended. He said, "Having endured the agony of 4 years of war, we rise as a new nation to perfect the continental temple of freedom and equality, the foundations of which were so wisely laid by our forefounders. From these foundations we have removed the only 2 faulty stones, those on which were inscribed the fatal words compromise and slavery. In all this broad land, no man now owns his brother man. You men of color, you citizens of Louisiana who wear the livery of Africa's burnished sun, give thanks unto God that he has turned and overturned until the humblest of you stands erect in the majesty of free manhood, the equal of your fellow man before the laws of your country, as you are before the beneficent Father of all." Then he offers this vision. He says, "I behold a vision grander than that of Columbus, sweeping from the rock-bound coast of the storm-lashed Atlantic to the golden shores of the sleeping Pacific, and that from the Rio Grande to the perpetual snows of Mount Hood. It is inhabited by one people who, though differing in origin, are homogeneous in language, thought, and sentiments, and who, though the citizens of many states, each having its own constitution, recognize as supreme one government, and that the freest yet devised by man. I cannot better illustrate the value of this unity than by pointing to the future of your own beautiful city." He's talking about New Orleans here. "It is the entry point for the commerce of the Gulf, the trade of which proceeds under our bright flag. The river that winds around you carries to the sea the waters of 60,000 miles of river course. The valley it drains will sustain a population of 500 millions of people. They will be free, intelligent, enterprising, and given to commerce. But as I look through the vista of a brief future, the glories of the great cities of antiquity fade away, and Florence, Venice, and Genoa recur to me as but so many distant villages. Not Paris or London will be your equal, for behind each of them lies a territory less in extent and resources than any one of a score of American states, while behind New Orleans lie the resources, agricultural, mineral, and manufacturing of a territory broader and richer than all of Europe. So that was certainly not a Malthusian outlook, and it was the outlook that was being given to the country at the conclusion of a war in which more American lives were lost in that single conflict than in, I think, nearly all of the wars, at least, that have been fought up to now. So I just wanted to say that as a way of sort of, prior to any concluding remarks you guys have, just to bring it back to the theme of tonight in terms of the influence of Henry Carey, the American system economists, and their overwhelming clarity about the notion of singular federal government, which is at the same time extending the notion of development to the whole world, and that would be a basis for this Treaty of Westphalia development architecture that we were talking about. So, Rick, do you have anything you want to say at this point?
Yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
I want to mention a great Ukrainian, Vladimir Vernadsky, the inventor of biogeochemistry, and also the father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb. But he said that even at that time, writing in, some time ago, that the Earth could support 3 trillion people. So I don't know how he got that, but it doesn't surprise me very much. And I'm thinking now, once we break these Malthusians, their hold on everything, we're going to start growing. We have plenty more people that we can put on Earth, but there's a couple of trillion galaxies out there, latest estimate, and each one of those galaxies has hundreds of billions of stars, all of which are nuclear reactors, and many of which could become more suns for us to build civilization around. So we'll have trillions and quadrillions of people, and they'll be a lot better off and a lot happier than we are today. So, and I think we're on the brink of that because we're going to beat these dirty rats. They're so exposed.
Okay, thanks. Paul?
What you were just reading from Congressman Pig Iron Kelly is it's inspiring every time you hear it, because there is, among the very best of the Irish political leaders, who are few, but among the very best of them, there is a real commitment to the general welfare in the most aggressive way, which is just inspiring, and it's worth thinking in conclusion about St. Patrick himself, who was the most successful Christian missionary, I guess you would say, the most successful Christianizer in all of human history, by far, in that he, for the first time, was able to make an entire pagan population Christian, and then his followers proceeded to do the same with many of the nations of Europe, not only in England and in Germany with St. Boniface, but all the way over to Eastern Europe and down into what was the Byzantine Empire at that time. This is in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries. He was in himself a really extraordinary organizer for the general welfare, and was able to accomplish things that no Christian had been able to accomplish up to that time, outside the Roman elites, who tended to be the Christians up through the beginning of the 5th century, and actually out into the populations of Europe as a whole. So that's what I would say.
Good. Okay, thanks. Marcia?
Well, let me just read a very short thing from an advertisement that's in the Washington Post here in Washington, and probably some other papers, titled Irish Unity in Our Time. And one paragraph towards the end says, "We believe that Irish unity is the firm will of the Irish nation and will serve the best interests of all who share the island, citizens abroad, and the wider diaspora." And all I wanted to say is this impulse is worldwide to reassert sovereignty, and Paul identified, and that means, or you can presume the general welfare, at least action in the public interest. And so I just think that and there's examples of that, not for tonight, but everyone from a former president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, he said, get with the program. We should end NATO. Let's start acting in the public interest. Nations in Africa doing this. So we have a situation that we're facing terrible war, potential annihilation, suffering of so many people, and yet at the same time great opportunity. So that's all I wanted to end with. We can take heart and enlist people in what will make a difference in the world. Thanks.
Okay, so I want to thank Rick Sanders, Paul Gallagher, and Marcia Baker for being with us. I also want to say to people to go onto line and get our petition. If you haven't signed it or haven't circulated it, that's what the whole conception behind what we did tonight is all about, this higher conception of a Treaty of Westphalia approach in which geopolitics doesn't in any way figure. That even if you thought that the invasion of Ukraine is wrong, even if you thought any number of things about what may be questionable or right in the situation, whatever your view is, the point is no geostrategic, geopolitical approach can in any way end with anything other than doom, probably thermonuclear doom. It's not possible. What has to be done is to lift the entire approach to resolution of this circumstance, if that's what we are trying to get, to the level of the thinking of people like Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, like Gottfried Leibniz, like Abraham Lincoln, and like Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon LaRouche. You have to lift it to that level and look at it from the top in order to be able to get an approach which can reconcile not merely the so-called participants in the conflict, adversaries in the conflict, but can reconcile the world as a whole to a new direction, a higher-ordered direction. There were hearings today in Washington concerning the certain prospects for thermonuclear fusion power. We have yet to really analyze them to see if there was any real content. But whatever may have been the discussion in them, the idea of looking at the notion of taking humanity to a higher platform of potential relative population density to increasing the energy throughput of the systems as a whole. That is certainly the approach that we have to see a lot more of, particularly in Washington. But I'll just say finally that our publications, particularly the EIR, the Alert Service, and our daily briefing, are now indispensable for people to keep their head on straight in an atmosphere and in a circumstance where the wilderness of mirrors that's being invoked through various forms of propaganda is truly bewildering to many. So we encourage you to get those publications, circulate them, circulate the petition, and work with us to make the vision that we have of this new architecture a reality. We invite you to join us at Saturday for our town meeting, Manhattan town meeting, and we invite you back here again next week, at which point we will have everything figured out technically and be able to engage in more questions and answers. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, I want to thank everybody, and we'll see you again either Saturday or next week.